In the autumn of 1854, 37 travelers vanished on the roads leading to Millbrook, Connecticut, their bodies never found. The townsfolk blamed wolves, bandits, and the cruel winter. But the truth was far darker. For over a century, the elders of Millbrook kept a terrible secret. Every one of those souls was last seen heading toward the Hartwell brothers' grist mill on Copper Creek, a mill whose massive grinding stones never stopped turning, even when no grain was brought to grind. That year, as mist curled over the creek, young Timothy Phelps stumbled on a discovery that would expose the most horrific chapter in Connecticut's industrial past. Millbrook in the 1850s was a thriving New England town of 800, built on farming timber and trade, its main street lined with tidy clapboard houses and the white-steepled church ringing out each Sunday. The town's pride was industry: 3 sawmills, 2 tanneries, a blacksmith's forge, and above all, the Hartwell mill, 4 stories of timber and stone clinging to a sharp bend in Copper Creek, its great water wheel turning like a heartbeat. The sound of grinding stones rumbled for miles, a sound so constant it blended with bird song, while inside the air was thick with the smell of flour and the whir of gears and belts. Josiah and Elias Hartwell inherited the mill from their father Solomon, a pious man who had built it with his own hands. Unlike him, the brothers were men apart. Josiah, huge and grim, ruled with cold precision, collecting debts without mercy. Elias, thin and restless, spoke only in the language of machines, his genius keeping the mill running smoother than silk. They never married, living alone in their father's crumbling house on the hill, bound entirely to their work. People whispered about them, but no one dared speak too loudly. The Hartwell mill was the lifeblood of Millbrook. And yet in that fateful autumn, as the millstones ground endlessly, something far more sinister than grain was drawn into their relentless turning. Farmers depended on the Hartwell mill to grind their grain. Bakers relied on its steady stream of fine white flour, and merchants prospered from the trade it attracted, with orders coming from as far as Providence and New York. The summer of 1854 had been kind to Millbrook. Wheat rolled across the hills in golden waves, corn stood high orchards, sagged with fruit, and the 4th of July had been marked with fireworks from Hartford and a brass band from Waterbury. Talk of progress was everywhere. A railway promised to arrive by 1856. A new schoolhouse was approved, and a Boston doctor was considering a practice in town. In a place where everyone knew one another's business, the rhythms of life moved with the seasons, planting, harvesting, and the long winters when the millstones never stopped. Yet beneath this prosperity lingered old whispers, stories from before the town existed. The Mohegan avoided the bend in Copper Creek, where the mill now stood, saying the water sometimes ran backward, and old tales spoke of lights in the gorge on moonless nights. Strange sounds that were neither creek nor wind. Most dismissed them, but on foggy evenings when the millstones groaned through the mist, even the most practical would quicken their step. As autumn came and the leaves flared gold, and crimson strangers began to appear, silent, solitary, unfamiliar faces in a town where newcomers were rare. Then they began to vanish. The first was a peddler named Jacob Morse, last seen on September 15th after telling the boarding house matron he was headed to the Hartwell mill to offer oil for their machines. 3 days later, his wagon was found abandoned on an old logging road 2 miles north, horse grazing. Calmly, goods untouched, even the cash box left with $17. But Morse himself had disappeared. Everything in the wagon was coated in a strange layer of fine flour, as though a sack had burst over it. A week later, 22-year-old Thomas Griswold from Copper Falls vanished. After an evening courting Alice Putnam, he set off for home along the creek path despite her pleas to take the main road. He never arrived. 3 days of searching found only his hat tangled in brambles near the mill's tail race and that same eerie dusting of flour on the leaves. Next went a traveling photographer named Clarence Hooker, and soon after a married couple returning from New Haven. With 5 disappearances in 3 weeks, the town's whispers turned to dread. Constable Rufus Baldwin, a cautious veteran of the Mexican War, pinned a map and marked each vanishing, noting they all clustered around the Hartwell mill, all occurring between dusk and dawn, and always with that cursed veil of flour left behind. On October 3rd, Baldwin decided to confront the Hartwells. The mill was running when he arrived at midday, the stone's steady rumble humming through the ground. Josiah Hartwell was in his cramped office, ledger open, and he looked up with those cold gray eyes, showing no surprise. "Come about the missing folks, I expect," he said flatly. "5 people gone," Josiah Baldwin said. "All last seen here. Dangerous roads," Josiah replied without looking up. "High creeks this year. A man could slip, wash away to the sound, never found." Baldwin held his stare. "Mind if I look around?" The miller's expression didn't change. "Mills are dangerous for the untrained," Josiah said. "Elias doesn't like strangers near the machines." "I'll be careful," Baldwin answered. "Suit yourself," Josiah said at last, "but keep away from the grinding floor when the stones are running." As Baldwin turned to leave the office, Josiah's voice followed him, calm and cold as riverstone. "You'd best solve these disappearances soon, Constable. Bad for business. Talk like this makes people take their grain elsewhere." For 2 hours, Baldwin combed through the mill, seeing nothing but sacks of grain barrels of flour and the relentless turning of the great stones. Elias Hartwell trailed him like a shadow, silent, except for the constant twitch of his fingers adjusting valves and levers. His pale eyes fixed on Baldwin with an intensity that made the lawman's skin crawl. Only as he was leaving did Baldwin notice what made his blood run cold, the massive French burr stones grinding on empty no grain in the hopper above, and yet that ghostly flour dust clung to everything. "Why are you running empty stones?" Baldwin asked, startled to find Elias suddenly at his elbow. Cleaning, the younger brother whispered, a dry rustle of a voice. "Got to keep them sharp. Got to keep them hungry." That night, Baldwin could not shake the unease that answer planted in him. He told his wife he was out checking on a prowler at the Davenport farm, but instead he took a position on the hill above the mill. Through the October dark, he watched the wheel turn the stones, humming their endless hunger, and before long, he saw things that made him doubt his own eyes. Between midnight and 3-3 wagons came silently down the road. No lanterns, no calls, just shadowy teams that moved as if they knew the way by heart. Each wagon heavy under canvas, each leaving an hour later empty. Then just past 3, something happened that Baldwin would never speak of without a shiver. By the end of October 37, souls had vanished from the roads around Millbrook. Fear gripped the valley. Farmers traveled in armed groups, the stagecoach added an extra guard, and families barred their doors at sunset, keeping lanterns burning till dawn. Reverend Ezra Putnam called for days of prayer. The superstitious began leaving offerings at the old Indian marker stone near Copper Creek, just as their grandparents had done during the troubles of 1793. Most simply avoided the mill road at night. But on the fog-drenched night of October 28th, 16-year-old Timothy Phelps, son of the blacksmith and foolish with young love, decided to take the shortcut past the mill. He wanted to see Jenny Lockwood, and the fog, thick as gray wool, seemed like protection. The world was muffled to a hush, the creak and splash of the water wheel, the deep growl of the grinding stones, and then other sounds. Low voices. The scrape of something heavy across wood. Heart pounding, Timothy crept toward the lights spilling from the mill's loading dock, and through the shifting fog he saw them. The Hartwell brothers, their silhouettes stark in lamplight, working with slow precision to unload their wagon. But these weren't sacks of grain. The shapes were wrong, long limp wrapped in canvas. Then a bundle slipped from Elias's grasp, and an arm fell free, pale and stiff as bone fingers clawing at the air. A sound escaped Timothy, gasp, whimper he never knew, and Josiah's head whipped around. Someone's watching? The elder brother set his voice a steel blade. Fog's thick, Elias muttered, but his restless hands stilled. No one travels on a night like this. Someone is. Timothy fled. He tore through the fog brambles, ripping his clothes, terror closing his throat, certain Josiah's iron grip was at his back. He didn't stop until he crashed into the smithy's door, sobbing and shaking, a strip of canvas clenched in his fist, stained with something dark. His father, Samuel, a practical man, saw the scratches on his boy's face, the mud, the fear, and believed him. He loaded his rifle, barred the door, and sat guard until dawn. At first light, Timothy carried his story to Constable Baldwin, while Samuel rode to Hartford to fetch the county sheriff. By noon, a posse of 20 armed men surrounded the mill. Josiah emerged for his weekly trip to the store, and seeing the rifles, only raised his brows. "Gentlemen, to what do I owe this visit?" Sheriff Cornelius Wadsworth stepped forward, his voice like iron. "Josiah Hartwell, you and your brother are under arrest on suspicion of murder." "Murder," Josiah repeated, almost amused. "Who exactly do you think I've murdered?" "We'll start with the 37 people who've gone missing." "Missing people aren't murdered people, Sheriff." "Show me a body." "We intend to," Wadsworth replied grimly, "starting with your mill." For the first time, something flickered in Josiah's slate-gray eyes, not fear, but calculation. "You have a warrant?" "Don't need one, not with this many gone. I have cause to search every building in the county." Josiah's jaw hardened, but he stepped aside. "Elias won't like strangers touching his machinery," he said. "Then he'd better cooperate," the sheriff answered. And what they found in the mill's lower levels was beyond anything Millbrook could have imagined. The grinding room looked ordinary. At first, the huge millstones turning with their slow, steady weight, the air thick with grain dust. But Baldwin, remembering what he had seen on his earlier visit, glanced up at the hopper and saw it was empty, the stones still chewing on nothing. "Stop the wheel," Sheriff Wadsworth ordered. Elias, watching from the stairs, shook his head, pale eyes darting like trapped birds. "Can't. Won't. The stones must feed." "Stop it or we'll break it," the sheriff warned. Josiah, silent until then, gave a curt nod. With a shudder of reluctance, Elias threw the lever, and the great machine groaned to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening. "Raise the runner stone," Wadsworth said. The brothers exchanged a look that made Baldwin's skin prickle. "That stone weighs 2 tons, Josiah murmured. "Takes special gear." "Then you'd better start." It took 3 hours of sweat and winching to lift the massive wheel. As the stone rose inch by inch, a stench seeped into the room, sweet and rancid meat rotting under the scent of grain. Men gagged and stumbled outside to retch. What they found beneath the runner stone froze every heart. The stationary bedstone had been altered. Instead of neat grooves to carry flour, deeper channels had been carved, all leading to a central hole, and ground into those grooves were shards of bone and teeth. Bits of fabric, a crushed wedding ring, a cracked pocket watch stopped forever at 3:17. The hole led to a chute, and the chute into the foundation. When they smashed through the boards and followed it down, they found chambers cut from solid rock beneath the mill. Some were empty, others contained the truth the valley had feared. Later, the sheriff would write that they found remains of at least 43 victims. The bodies, or what was left of them, had been systematically processed. Flesh stripped away, bones stacked like firewood, others reduced to pale dust in the mill above. On the walls, scratched in Elias's cramped hand, were tallies, names, and dates stretching back not months, but decades. The earliest was 1834. 20 years of murder. 20 years of grinding human remains into the flour that fed the valley. The arrest of the Hartwell brothers shocked the state. Newspapers from Boston to Philadelphia splashed the story across their front pages. They called them the Millbrook Cannibals, though no evidence suggested they'd eaten their victims. Under questioning, Josiah spoke with eerie calm. It began by accident, he claimed. In 1834, a drifter broke into the mill, and Elias caught him. There was a struggle. The man fell down the stairs and broke his neck. "We should have reported it," Josiah said flatly. "But times were hard. We owed the bank." And Elias said, "Why waste good meat?" He remembered the winter of 1816, the year without summer, when their father had ground acorns and fish into flour to survive. Bones, Elias reasoned, were protein. Ground fine, they made the bread more nourishing. Just once, Josiah insisted, just to get through the winter. No one would know. The stones would grind anything to dust. But once they crossed that line, there was no turning back. The flour became famous white as snow, soft as silk bread that rose higher, cakes that stayed tender. Orders grew, profits swelled, and the brothers needed more. So they began to choose victims who would not be missed, peddlers, drifters, travelers bound for distant towns. For 2 decades, they kept their harvest small enough to escape notice. But in 1854, Josiah admitted Elias changed. He said the stones were hungry, always hungry, and he began taking more. It wasn't the killing, Josiah said, but the process itself that consumed his brother. Elias recorded everything: times, weights, bone to flour ratios, the grinding speed best suited to human remains. Investigators found his journal's 3 volumes of meticulous notes as cold and mechanical as if he were describing gears instead of people. Most horrifying of all, the ledgers revealed that for 20 years, the valley had been baking bread with flour mixed with human bone. The trial that followed was the most infamous in Connecticut's history. Crowds packed the courthouse. Hawkers sold millstone trinkets and bags of flour labeled "Guaranteed Pure." Josiah sat motionless, his voice as flat as ever, bewildered that anyone could be outraged by what he called practical necessity. Elias, deprived of his beloved machines, unraveled quickly. His hands twitched as if working invisible levers, muttering about feed rates and gears, until he was declared insane and sent to Middletown Hospital. The case against them was overwhelming. Timothy Phelps's trembling account of that foggy night, Baldwin's testimony, the bones, the journals. The valley that once owed its prosperity to the Hartwell mill would never forget the price it had paid. The courtroom fell silent as relatives came forward one by one to identify what the posse had found in the mill's hidden chambers. Rings, watches, buttons, tattered scraps of fabric. But it was the testimony of Dr. Marcus Davenport from Yale that turned horror into nightmare. He told the jury that the remains showed a deliberate, methodical system of processing. This was not chaos, he said. This was industrial murder. Human bodies reduced with the same precision as grain, dismantled into components with cold, mechanical efficiency. I have seen battlefields, gentlemen, he told them. I have cut open soldiers by the hundreds, but I have never seen human beings reduced to inventory. Against such words, the defense could mount little more than a plea for pity. Josiah's attorney argued that poverty and desperation had driven the brothers to extremes, that they killed not out of malice, but out of necessity to preserve the family mill. The jury was unmoved. On December 15th, 1854, after 3 short hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict, guilty on 43 counts of murder. Josiah Hartwell would hang. But the story did not end in the courtroom. In the weeks after the trial, fear and revulsion spread like a contagion. Households across the valley stared at their flour bins with dawning horror. Was this sack milled before the arrests? How could anyone be sure? Some families burned every bag. Others tried to return their flour to merchants who refused to take it back. Bakeries closed their doors. Farmers could not sell their wheat. The grain trade collapsed overnight. Whispers grew that the Hartwell brothers had not been alone, that this practice had been an industry-wide secret. Then the sickness began, whether real or imagined, no one could say. People fell ill with cramps and fever. Children dreamed of blood in their bread. A woman in Copper Falls claimed she could taste iron in every bite she ate. The physician from Yale returned, but found no poison, no contamination, only a community consumed by horror. They have discovered they were unwilling cannibals, he wrote, and the knowledge has poisoned them more deeply than any disease. Even that might have passed in time. But the mill itself refused to stay silent. Though sealed by court order, people began to report strange lights in its windows at night, the sound of grinding stones echoing faintly across the frozen valley. One morning, the great wheel locked in place since the investigation was found turning in the creek despite the gates being shut. Sheriff Baldwin, promoted after Wadsworth's retirement, investigated himself. He found no one inside yet. A fine coat of flour dust lay fresh on the grinding room floor, as if the stones had been running moments before. Impossible, he muttered, looking up at the runner stone still chained in its raised position. The council voted to tear down the mill without waiting for spring. But on the cold morning when the work crew arrived, they found a nightmare waiting for them. Elias Hartwell had escaped from the asylum 3 days earlier and had somehow reached Millbrook on foot, barefoot, half-mad, clothed only in the thin garments of his cell. No one could explain how he survived the winter, but there he stood before the grinding stones, his raw, bleeding hands caressing the controls like a lover. "Can't stop," he said when Baldwin confronted him at gunpoint. "The stones are hungry, always hungry. Father knew. Josiah knew. You'll know too." Somehow, despite the locked gates and frozen wheel, the stones were turning again faster now, dust billowing like smoke. Elias's cracked lips pulled back into a fevered grin. "Do you know what we learned, Sheriff? The stones remember. Every grain, every kernel, every bone, they remember the taste. You think they can stop? You think you can starve stones that have drunk so deep?" His laughter was like metal grinding on metal as he threw the levers, and the entire building shuddered The stones screamed faster and faster until the room was a whirlwind of choking flour. There was a thunderous crash, a blinding flash of light. When the dust cleared, Elias Hartwell was gone. Not escaped. Gone. All that remained were his torn asylum clothes and a scatter of blood on the bedstone. No human body could have passed through the gap between the stones. Baldwin sealed the mill again, this time with iron bars, but the legend had already been born. Elias's vanishing became a new curse on Millbrook, and people swore that on certain winter nights, the stones could still be heard grinding empty and hungry. And so the valley waited, shivering under a sky of ice for January 20th, 1855, the day Josiah Hartwell would hang. As January 20th drew near, Millbrook descended into a kind of madness. The very air seemed to grow heavy, as if the coming execution cast its shadow backward through time. Animals refused to drink from Copper Creek, rolling their eyes and shying away as if from an unseen hand. Every mill in the county began to fail in ways no one could explain. Grinding stones cracked without warning, wheels froze mid-turn, gears shredded themselves as if chewing invisible bone. Children throughout the valley woke screaming from the same nightmare that they were grains of wheat tumbling helplessly toward an endless pair of stones that ground together with the sound of laughter. In Hartford, Josiah Hartwell waited in his cell, calm as ever. The walls ran with moisture, and the January frost thickened the bars, but he seemed untouched by the cold. Day after day, he covered the stone with intricate diagrams, drawn in charcoal gear ratios, calculated to the third decimal stress points, marked and reinforced new designs for faster grinding without losing fineness. Guards swore he never slept. At any hour they would find him awake, staring at the walls, or else gazing at something beyond them, something only he could see. He ate with mechanical precision, chewing each bite exactly 20 times, before swallowing as if even nourishment was a process to be optimized. When Reverend Putnam came to offer salvation, Josiah listened politely, but without a flicker of interest, his slate-gray eyes fixed and cold. When the minister paused, Josiah spoke at last, not of repentance, but of grain. "Do you know the perfect moisture content for wheat storage, Reverend?" he asked softly. 14%. Less and it shatters, more and it molds. Everything has an ideal state for processing. Everything. By then, even hardened criminals in neighboring cells had begun to beg for transfers, claiming they couldn't sleep. They said something about Josiah Hartwell bent the air around him, as if he lived a fraction of a second out of sync with the rest of the world. 3 nights before the hanging, that strange stillness broke. Sheriff Baldwin was making his rounds when he heard something that stopped him cold. Josiah Hartwell laughing. It was not the fevered cackle of his brother, but deep rolling laughter, the kind of laugh that comes when a man finally sees a joke no one else understands. Sheriff Josiah called his voice warm for the first time. "Come here. I need to tell you something. Something important." Baldwin hesitated at the bars. The lamplight trembled, throwing the diagrams on the wall into motion as if the gears and levers Josiah had drawn were slowly turning, driven by some invisible wheel. Josiah stood tall on the gallows, his chain still, his breath misting in the frozen air as the crowd waited silent as tombstones. For a long moment he said nothing, only let his gaze drift over the valley of faces as if weighing them one by one like sacks of wheat. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but carried to the edge of the yard. "You think this ends with me?" he asked. "You think hanging a man starves a hunger that's been grinding since before any of you were born? The stones will keep turning. They always do." smiled, then slow and terrible, and in that bleak morning light, his teeth seemed polished like bone. You've all eaten from them, all of you. There's a part of the mill in every one of you now. With that, he fell silent, and the hangman, pale and sweating, pulled the lever. The trap gave way, and Josiah Hartwell dropped his neck, breaking with a crack that seemed to echo off the cold stone walls like a millstone striking true. For an instant, as his body swayed, a sound rose faintly from the frozen valley, a deep, distant rumble like stones grinding grain, and more than one witness swore that carried on. That sound came a whisper that was not quite wind, still hungry. When Josiah spoke, his voice carried to the farthest edges of the yard without ever rising. "You think this ends with me?" he said. "You think the hunger dies when the feeder is gone? The stones remember, Sheriff. They remember every grain, every bone, every life that's passed through them. They remember, and they hunger, and they will call to others as they called to us." He paused, and in that sudden hush, every soul present heard it, a faint rumble like thunder under the earth, like giant stones grinding far below their feet. "The mill will stand empty," Josiah went on, "but not still. Never still. And one day when the hunger grows too great, when the stones can no longer bear their emptiness, someone will come. Someone always comes. Efficiency calls to those who can hear it. Utilization sings to those who understand. And the grinding..." He smiled, then, a terrible, unnatural smile that stripped away any trace of humanity. "The grinding never ends." When the hangman stepped forward with the hood, Josiah shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Let them see. Let them remember. Let them know what waits in the dark." At precisely 8:00 a.m., the trap was sprung. Josiah Hartwell dropped the rope, snapping taut with a crack like breaking stone. And at that exact moment, across the entire Connecticut River Valley, every mill roared to life. In Colchester, the frozen Browning wheels spun despite ice-choked gates. In Warehouse Point, millstones that had been separated for cleaning slammed together and began to grind. From Hartford to the Massachusetts line, a terrible grinding rose, a mechanical roar so deep and furious that it sent people staggering from their homes, hands clamped over their ears. At the abandoned Hartwell mill, guards swore the chained wheel spun so fast it hurled frozen spray 100 feet into the air. The locked water gates poured like a flood. Windows exploded outward. Doors bolted shut were blown open as if by a giant's breath. And from the grinding room came a light, not the orange flicker of fire, but a cold silvery glow, like moonlight seen through clouds of flour. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. At exactly 8:01, as the prison clock told the minute of Josiah's death, every mill fell silent. The air held a stillness so deep it felt like the valley itself was holding its breath. Witnesses swore they saw the impossible in those final seconds. As the mills quieted, Josiah's hanged body seemed to collapse inward, shrinking as though something had been drawn out of him. When they cut him down, the corpse weighed half what it should have. And the undertaker whispered that the flesh under his skin had a strange, grainy texture, as if it had already begun to be ground. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Baldwin returned to the Hartwell mill and found it deserted. The guards had vanished without a trace, their rifles propped against the walls, their boot prints ending abruptly at the threshold. Inside, the chaos of the morning was gone. The place gleamed. Every surface scrubbed, every gear oiled, every massive stone polished to a mirror sheen. And carved into the wooden floor of the grinding room, 3 feet high, was a single word, hungry. Baldwin ordered the mill sealed once more, this time with every entrance bricked up. But even as he gave the order, he knew it wouldn't matter. The mill had tasted something richer than grain, and the memory of that taste would never fade. The stones would wait, and one day they would feed again. Standing alone in that spotless grinding room, Baldwin heard something faint beneath the silence. A deep, patient rumble like a stomach that had learned to wait centuries between meals. He fled and never returned. From deep beneath the mill, deeper than any basement, came a low grinding that never ceased. In the days following Josiah Hartwell's execution, investigators made one last terrible discovery. Beneath the foundations of the mill below, even the chambers where bodies had been hidden, they broke into a structure. No colonial hand had built walls of fitted stone far older than the town, carved with symbols worn by centuries. And at its center was a single massive slab, a stone shaped like a millstone, though no tool had cut it. Its spiral grooves led to a hole that seemed to descend into endless black. Around it lay offerings of corn, tobacco, and bones, some animal, some human. This, Dr. Davenport wrote in his final report, is why the Hartwells built here. They did not bring evil to this place. They were drawn to it. Called. Faced with the horror of what lay beneath their town, the council made a choice. They did not demolish the mill. Instead, they entombed it. They bricked up every entrance, tore down. The wheels shattered the millstones and scattered the fragments into Long Island Sound. They pumped tons of cement into the ancient chamber until the pumps choked, and they diverted Copper Creek to cut it off from its power. With its heart sealed, the mill stood like a tombstone as the forest crept in. But Millbrook itself never recovered. Within 5 years, most of its people had fled. The railway bypassed it. By 1870, it was a ghost on the map, its silent mills collapsing into ruin. Yet the stories endured. Hunters swore their dogs would not track near the creek. Travelers reported hearing the faint rhythmic groan of stones grinding in fog. And every few years someone else vanished, their abandoned belongings dusted with something fine and pale as flour. Timothy Phelps, the boy whose terrified testimony had exposed the Hartwells, lived to be 87. On his deathbed in 1923, he gripped his grandson's hand and whispered, "Stay away from mills, boy. Stay away from old stones and old hungers. Some things, once they get a taste, never stop." The Hartwells knew. God help them, they fed it until it owned them body and soul. He died clutching a fistful of wheat, as though even at the end, he needed to remember the difference between grain and what else might be ground. The Hartwell mill still stands, though the forest has swallowed it whole. Trees grow through its broken windows, vines bind its walls, and Copper Creek, defying every effort to tame it, has found its way back to the sealed foundation. Locals say that on nights when the fog comes rolling in from the Sound, you can hear it again, the low, distant rumble of something grinding, patient and hungry. In 1954, exactly a century after the arrests, a New York developer tried to clear the land for homes. 50 feet from the mill, the first bulldozer died. Every machine they brought failed the same way. After 3 weeks of costly breakdowns, the project was abandoned. Today, the land is a state preserve. Official records list the mill as an unsafe historic ruin closed to the public. Those who know the truth prefer it that way, because some hungers never sleep. They only wait, and so this mystery lingers. Was the evil that took root here born of desperate men? Or is it older than memory, a place marked forever, calling the weak-willed to feed it? What do you think? Was the truth finally revealed, or did the stones keep their deepest secret for themselves? If you've stayed with me to the end, share this story with someone who loves a good mystery. Subscribe for more tales like this. And remember, sometimes the thing we fear in the dark isn't what waits for us there. It's what's been waiting all along, patient as stone. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.